So let us address the idea of classical conditioning, and I'm actually going to include Thorndike's laws in this tutorial as well, even though we're actually going to touch on this and a couple of other tutorials, not least when we talk about operant conditioning later on. But when we talk about classical conditioning, I want you to understand that this is absolutely clearly what we would call an associationist theory. Okay, so please have it in your mind that this theory of classical conditioning is one of numerous associationist theory, another of which, operant conditioning, we're going to have a look at in a different tutorial. So what does that actually mean to us? Well, here's kind of the definition I want you to have clear in your mind. So I'm going to refer to this as and the pink stuff is kind of like real key words in our definition. It is an association. An association can be built, an association can be built between a stimulus, back to the pink, a stimulus and a response. Now, I don't think there's anything too shocking in there, too revelatory, for want of a better word. But what we're saying there is that, let's put this into a practical sort of scenario here. What we're saying is that if we train, say, a table tennis effectively, so that every time a shot goes off the side of the table low on their forehand side, their response to that specific stimulus is that they hit a across table heavy topspin loop shot, because that loop shot is going to buy them time and push their opponent back off the table. So on that basis, that would be the specific response that we would want to have to that stimulus, assuming that is the correct response. Someone out there is a brilliant table tennis player, might be thinking, James, you are badly mistaken about that one. But anyway, you take my point. We're looking at building a specific stimulus response. So we can call this our giant S, we're not going to include the giant, and our stimulus response bond. Okay, so there is a bond, literally a bond, between the specific stimulus and the specific response. And of course, a couple of things that are important to us. First of all, we want it to be the right response. Okay, so we don't just want any response, but we want the right response to the relevant stimulus. And we also, as we've touched on numerous parts of this course already, we also want the response to be technically correct. So it also has implications for how we go about learning and habitualizing, a word we're going to come to in a second, this particular response. So we're assuming that the response is high quality and relevant for the stimulus that's being presented. So, kind of an analogy, what is wrong with my pronunciation? An analogy today. An analogy I'd like to build with you is that this model is what we'd call a form of conditioning. Conditioning, not that thing what makes your hair a bit softer, but conditioning we can think very similar to a concept of programming. So if you think about how a computer is programmed, for example, there are lines of code that are written to give specific instructions of what the computer does under specific circumstances. Well, conditioning is an attempt in a sporting scenario to do exactly that thing. So that becomes an interesting concept, right? Because it's almost like we're treating the brain as just a processing computer type device. We're saying that if a certain stimulus is presented, the movement will be responded in this specific way. So what we're looking to achieve is from our training, we're looking to build the concept of habits. Okay, training should produce habits, and of course we're interested in those habits being good, or maybe even the best habits. So therefore training quality and coaching quality is very important. So the training is like the conditioning, okay, or training I should say is the conditioning. It is the conditioning, it is the programming. And the habit, we like to think that with enough repetition it becomes automatic. Okay, so in the table tennis example I used before, as soon as the angle of that ball from the opponent starts going towards the side of the table on my forehand side, low shot, automatically I am programmed to produce the heavy loop cross table, push the opponent back type shot. So that, of course, is important that we get that conditioning in. Can you see how powerful that would be? That if we had those responses programmed into a performer in some kind of like it almost feels like a pseudo-scientific type of process, right? Where we're literally programming athletes to perform in certain ways, that could be highly effective. Now, a couple of other things. I want to introduce to you what I'm going to just loosely refer to as keywords. Now, I thought about presenting this in all kinds of different ways. These are words that are effectively highly associated with this theory, and therefore you should use in any type of answer you make to this theory. The first one is that we're going through a process of behavior shaping. Okay, so we're shaping the behavior, the response, the R to a specific S, the stimulus. We're shaping the behavior of the performer. Secondly, we're looking for that behavior to become, and I mentioned this earlier, habitualized. It becomes a habit. It becomes automatic. So that's a really nice term for us to build into our answers. Thirdly, we're looking to build connections. So we can use connections with how we describe our coaching, how we present our coaching, how we present our practice, but we're building connections between specific stimuli and specific responses. And of course, that becomes very potent. Other points, we're also looking, as we said before, at producing automatic responses. Automatic responses. We are also using the concept of reinforcement to deepen the likelihood of the correct response being performed. So reinforcement, we've got three types of reinforcement. We've got positive reinforcement, which is kind of a reward or praise, a positive stimulator. We've got negative reinforcement, which is removing the criticizer that's been presented when the wrong response has been done. And we've got punishment, which is kind of literally, providing an unpleasant experience as a result of the wrong performance. Punishment's a bit of an awkward one, because, of course, when we think about it, we often think about it in that kind of punitive sense of punishing children, for example, for not shooting the basketball correctly. No. What we want to do there is, we might use negative reinforcement. So if the technique of the shot is incorrect, we provide some coaching and some improvement feedback. And when the performer corrects it, we don't offer that criticism anymore. We replace it with positive reinforcement, such as praise, well done. The next thing to do is those sort of things. And crucially, repetition is highly important to this model because, of course, if we think about the bond between the stimulus and response, if we think about it literally being this line, it gets thicker and stronger and therefore more likely because of things such as repetition and reinforcement. Now then, to finish off with this particular tutorial, I want to address with you what we refer to as Thorndike's laws. Now, in many ways, this is a slightly different topic, but there's so much overlap that I'm going to include it here. It should be Thorndike's ''S. Thorndike's laws. And basically, Thorndike, bless him, came up with three laws. So they are as follows. Thorndike identified what we call the law of exercise. And I don't think this is going to surprise anybody, but the law of exercise says the following. It says that repetition, that I'm repeating, verging on singing, repetition strengthens SR bond. Okay, so can we build that into our practice environment for sport? Teachers, can we build it into our classroom models? Now then, the second law is we've got the law of effect. The law of effect. The law of effect effectively says reinforcement, whether it be positive, negative, or punishment-based, reinforcement, and all of those, in reality, are going to be used. Reinforcement strengthens, but it can, of course, be or weakens, because sometimes if the incorrect response is being used, I'm trying to get there's the end of the bracket there. Just trust me, I'm kind of running out of space there. Reinforcement strengthens or weakens because the response is the wrong one, the SR bond. So we need to use reinforcement to get the correct output that we're looking for. And finally, Thorndike's third law is the law of readiness. Okay, the law of readiness. And this is a very sort of intuitive, obvious point, really. But Thorndike argued that learning occurs only if the nervous and muscular system, so you know how we actually produce movement, the nervous and muscular systems are mature enough. So let me just think of a very practical, obvious example of this. If we're working with 6-year-olds and we're asking them to throw adult javelins, no matter how much repetitional reinforcement we've done, if they can't lift the thing, they're not going to be able to throw it right. Now, that's an obvious example, but it might be that if we think about that maturity, we've got to have the maturity of the nervous system being able to instruct the movement take place, and the muscular system to produce enough force or the rhythm of force for the movement to be effectively prepared. So that law of readiness for me is all about choosing the right practice of the right skill at the right time for the right individual, and then our reinforcement and our repetition will be effective in deepening the encoding of that learning into the long-term memory, so it becomes a more likely response to that stimulus. Cheers.